human rights situation in the Philippines is improving under the Marcos administration, at least for the President of the European Commission. Ursula von der Leyen said this in an exclusive interview with CNN Philippines.
There's much improvement, still topics that we have to discuss, issues that are important, that are raised in the constant dialogue that we have with the Philippines, but the environment is much better.
Von der Leyen is hoping the EU could finalize free trade negotiations with the Philippines soon. Human Rights Watch EU Director Philippe Dam joins us now from Brussels, Belgium, for his views. Philippe, thank you so much for joining us. Do you agree with the European Commission President that the Philippines' human rights environment is much better under the Marcos administration?
Right. Look, we would want EU Commission President von der Leyen to explain what she meant with that, right? What does it mean? Does it mean that there is a bit more re-engagement, discussions on human rights issues? Does it mean that there are a few cases less of extrajudicial killings? Well, the reality is that yes, these things happen, but it's coming from such a low bar from the previous administration that we would expect from Ursula von der Leyen that she does use her visit to really push for stronger improvements when it comes to human rights issues, and that she tackles the fallout and the consequences of the war on drugs and the lack of accountability for many killings. And she also flags other cases of concerns when it comes to attacks and harassment of journalists, activists, environmental, indigenous activists and political activists who continue to face harassment and intimidation, including via the use of red notices. So if the EU wants to continue to be seen as a champion for human rights globally and in the region, these are the issues that we would have expected von der Leyen to raise so that she can really push using EU's leverage for concrete improvements. Unfortunately, not hearing those words from human rights from the EU Commission's chair, in particular, not even using the words human rights when speaking on the side of Philippines president, is of great concern.
So, Philippe, it is a great concern, and that question that you raised, she did not even expound on the human rights situation in the country or even raise the ICC decision on the Duterte drug war during her discussions with President Marcos. This would have been the perfect venue for it.
Absolutely. An EU official should speak about human rights concerns and issues when they speak publicly on the side of other heads of states. This is the minimum that we can do to expect that the EU uses its leverage. And you're correct in the fact that not pushing for accountability for the crimes committed in the context of the war on drugs, not even pushing for one of the fundamentals of EU's foreign policy, and you name the International Criminal Court, that is a priority for the EU, but for which the Philippines government has vowed not to cooperate with, is for us a great gap in her performance during her visit in the Philippines. She should use her visit to really push strongly and publicly for progress. Accountability would have been an important thing to push for. Cooperation with the ICC is an important call that the EU should have been making. It's very disappointing that this is missing from her speaking points publicly, because it raises the questions of whether this was raised at all with the Philippines authorities, and how and whether the EU itself ties its relations with the Philippines to concrete human rights improvements. And again, the situation, as I mentioned earlier, is really complicated.
And there seems to be even a gap with the EU Special Representative for Human Rights, who raised concerns about the paltry number of convictions for the drug war killings. It seems like von der Leyen and the EU don't seem to be on the same page.
It raises questions of lack of consistency, right? Just a few weeks ago, the EU Special Representative for Human Rights did mention the important concerns for the human rights situation in the Philippines, including the lack of accountability, including the refusal to cooperate with the ICC, and flagged that these problems were still putting the Philippines at odds with some of its commitments under trade benefits from which the Philippines benefit from. And yes, you're right, there is a real lack of consistency, and we would have expected von der Leyen to repeat the calls from the EU representative on human rights, Eamon Gilmore. In fact, by not doing so, she weakens his calls, and it's important for the EU Commission to flag flag that its future engagement with the Philippines, including when it's connected to trade and future trade relations, and we can maybe come back to that, are connected and conditioned to human rights improvements.
Do you think that the EC president didn't raise a human rights issue because she's basically pursuing an EU-Philippines trade agreement, which has been stalled for 6 years now?
Look, trade agreements should never be disconnected from the context in which they operate, namely human rights issues, right? Poor independence of the judiciary, violence, human rights violations are not a good context for trade. And it would be in the EU's interest to have trade partners which do respect fundamentally human rights and human rights norms, and not flagging those concerns when coming to Manila and talking about the reopening of a trade deal, of a free trade agreement with the Philippines is to us a very strong gap. And it's particularly problematic because, as you mentioned before, the EU SR on human rights, Gilmore, had flagged that the Philippines is still at odds with some of its human rights commitments under another trade arrangement called the GSP, General Scheme of Preference, which grants 0% tariff for Philippines goods exported to the EU and conditioned to human rights, including accountability for grave human rights abuses. And by announcing a shift towards the discussions of a free trade agreement, it's really a step aside from insisting on the need to, first of all, meet Philippines' human rights commitment under this so-called GSP. So we would really call the European Commission to reinsist on the fact that the Philippines should respect its commitment on human rights under the GSP, the General Scheme of Preference, first, as a first step to demonstrate its commitment to human rights before moving towards in-depth discussion on a free trade agreement. And secondly, we would want the European Commission to insist on the need for these negotiations to go hand in hand with genuine commitments and demonstrated improvements when it comes to the human rights situations in the Philippines. That should start with accountability for the crimes committed, the executions committed in the context of the the war on drugs. It should also come with the end of harassment of activists and journalists and resolutions of the very emblematic and difficult cases faced by Senator De Lima and journalist and Nobel Prize winner Maria Ressa, which continue to face persecution for their legitimate activities. And again, it's a concern to us that von der Leyen didn't raise the cases of De Lima and Ressa.
Thank you so much for your insights and for joining us from Brussels, Belgium, Human Rights Watch EU Director Philippe Dam.